There is a version of World War II that most people carry around in their heads. It has clear sides. It has heroes and monsters separated by geography and uniform. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end that resolves into something that feels like justice. That version is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. The incompleteness is not accidental. It was produced by the same institutional machinery that produced the war itself. The same offices that stamped documents, filed reports, and decided which facts would travel forward into history and which would be quietly absorbed into storage rooms, burned in the final weeks of conflict, or reclassified so many times that access became effectively impossible within a single human lifetime. What remains when you pull at those threads is not a different war exactly, but a fuller one. A war that functioned the way large bureaucratic systems always function, through delegation, through paperwork, through the subdivision of responsibility into pieces small enough that no single person had to hold the weight of the whole. The war that emerges from the documents that were suppressed, delayed, or never intended for public view is not more dramatic than the one in textbooks. In many ways it is less dramatic, and that is precisely what makes it disturbing. The horror, when you trace it carefully through the archived material, was procedural. It moved through channels. It was approved, stamped, filed, and copied in triplicate. The first thing to understand about suppressed wartime documentation is that suppression rarely looked like suppression. It looked like classification. It looked like interagency disputes over jurisdiction. It looked like the deliberate omission of certain categories of information from official after-action reports. A document does not have to be burned to disappear. It only has to be placed in a folder whose existence is not indexed, whose contents are not described in any summary, and whose retrieval depends on knowing to ask for something whose existence you cannot confirm without having already seen it. This is how institutional memory works when institutions decide, at the highest levels, that certain things should not be remembered clearly. The decision itself rarely appears in writing. That is part of the design. One of the least discussed categories of wartime documentation involves the internal communications of the Allied powers regarding their own conduct towards civilian populations in occupied and contested territories. The image that survived the war, and that was actively cultivated in the decades following it, was of liberation as an uncomplicated good, armies arriving to restore order and dignity to people who had suffered under occupation. The documents tell a more textured story. Reports filed by civil affairs officers embedded with advancing Allied units in France, Italy, and Belgium describe conditions in liberated towns with a flatness that reads decades later as almost clinical. Looting by Allied soldiers was noted, categorized, and in many cases explicitly set aside as a matter not to be pursued through formal channels, because pursuit would require documentation that would itself become part of the record. The decision not to prosecute was itself rarely documented. It was communicated verbally, through the chain of command, which left the paper trail clean. The scale of sexual violence committed by soldiers of multiple Allied nations against civilian populations in liberated Europe was something that military authorities were aware of in real time. The reports existed. Medical officers filed them. Military police filed them. Civil affairs officers filed them. What happened to those reports followed a consistent pattern across multiple national military structures. They were received, acknowledged in internal correspondence, and then handled through administrative channels that ensured they would not aggregate into anything that looked like a systemic finding. Individual incidents were managed as individual incidents. The category itself, as a category, was not allowed to form officially, because the formation of a category would require a response commensurate with the category's size, and that response would conflict with the narrative of liberation that was simultaneously being constructed for domestic audiences back home. This was not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It was institutional behavior of a type that large organizations exhibit almost automatically when the alternative to suppression is a public relations problem of an unmanageable scale. The documents relating to the firebombing campaigns conducted by the British Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces over German cities represent one of the most carefully managed archival situations of the 20th century. The operational records exist, and many of them are available. What is less available, and what historians have spent decades trying to reconstruct from fragments, is the internal deliberative record, the communications between planners and commanders, in which the decision to shift from industrial targeting to area bombing of residential districts was made, justified, and then subsequently described in ways that obscured the deliberateness of the shift. The terminology used in planning documents evolved across the war in ways that tracked very closely with the political sensitivity of what was being described. Early documents used language about destroying industrial capacity and disrupting production. Later documents, as the targeting moved deeper into residential areas, began using phrases about disrupting worker morale and reducing the will of the enemy population to continue supporting the war effort. The shift in language tracked the shift in targeting almost exactly, but the shift in language was gradual enough, and the documents sufficiently distributed across different filing systems that the coherent arc of the decision-making process required serious archival reconstruction to make visible. The British government maintained restricted access to significant portions of the Bomber Command archive for decades after the war. Some of this was explained as protecting sources and methods. Some of it was explained as protecting the identities of individuals still living. But the practical effect, regardless of the stated rationale, was that the public record available to historians and journalists during the period when the strategic bombing campaign was most actively being debated in academic circles was incomplete in ways that systematically favored interpretations of the campaign that emphasized military necessity and minimized the degree to which civilian killing had been a deliberate operational goal rather than an unfortunate side effect. The records generated by the German military bureaucracy present a different archival situation because the collapse of the German state at the end of the war produced a dispersal of documentation across multiple capturing powers, each of whom had their own reasons for using, suppressing, or selectively releasing what they found. The Americans took enormous quantities of German records, microfilmed them, and returned the originals to West Germany, retaining copies in archives that were themselves classified at various levels for years after the war. The Soviets took what they captured and held it far more tightly, with portions of captured German documentation remaining inaccessible to Western researchers until the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and, in some cases, beyond that point. What this means in practical terms is that our understanding of the German military's internal decision-making processes is permanently shaped by which documents survived, which were taken by whom, and what those captors chose to do with them. There are entire categories of decision-making for which the documentary record has gaps that cannot be filled because the relevant documents either do not exist or exist in archives that have not been fully processed. The T4 program, which was the German program for the systematic killing of people deemed mentally or physically unfit, has been documented extensively in the post-war period, but the wartime documentation itself tells a story about normalization that the post-war accounts tend to flatten. The internal communications of the program's administrators show a bureaucratic culture in which the central logistical challenge was not moral, but operational. How to process the volume, how to ensure consistent record-keeping across facilities, how to communicate with families in ways that were legally defensible and administratively efficient. The letters sent to families of victims were standardized, printed in batches, and filled in with individual names and dates by clerical staff who handled dozens of them in a single working day. The cause of death listed was almost never accurate. There were internal guidelines for which false causes of death were considered most plausible given the documented health status of the individual, so that the falsification was itself done systematically, with internal consistency maintained so that the lies would hold up to casual scrutiny. The people doing this work were not, in the main, people who had been selected for particular cruelty. They were people who had been selected for administrative competence and who applied that competence to tasks they had been told were legal, necessary, and consistent with official policy, which, within the legal framework then in force in Germany, they were. The intersection of legality and morality is one of the central themes that runs through suppressed wartime documentation of almost every nation involved in the conflict. Things were done legally that were morally catastrophic. Things were done illegally that the official record chose not to acknowledge, because acknowledging them would create legal complications. The two domains, the legal and the moral, moved independently of each other throughout the war in ways that were sometimes visible in the documents and sometimes more revealingly visible in the absences. The places where a document should exist but does not, where a decision must have been made but no record of it can be found. The Japanese wartime medical program conducted at Unit 731 in Manchuria represents one of the most extensively documented suppressions of the post-war period, with the suppression itself now being part of the historical record in a way that makes it one of the clearest examples of how archival management functions. The United States government made a deliberate decision in the period immediately following Japan's surrender to offer immunity from prosecution to the scientists and administrators who had run the program in exchange for access to the data that the program had generated. This decision was made internally, communicated through classified channels, and not disclosed to the public or to the other Allied powers who were simultaneously conducting war crimes trials at which people were being executed for offenses that bore significant resemblance to what the Unit 731 personnel had done. The documentation of the immunity arrangement was itself classified and remained classified for decades. The Japanese government, for its own reasons having to do with domestic politics and the management of wartime memory, actively suppressed its own documentation of the program. The result was that for roughly 3 decades after the war, the program's existence was essentially unknown to the general public in either the United States or Japan, despite the fact that it had involved thousands of participants and had been known to significant portions of the military and scientific establishments of both countries. When American military interrogators processed captured Japanese personnel in the weeks following the surrender, the interrogation records that touched on Unit 731's activities were handled differently from records touching on other subjects. This differential handling was itself documented, but the documentation was distributed across multiple classification systems in ways that made the pattern difficult to see from any single vantage point. A researcher looking at the files of one office would see a gap. A researcher looking at the files of another office would see a different gap. The full shape of the decision only becomes visible when the gaps from multiple offices are placed next to each other and the outline of what is missing becomes legible. The treatment of German scientific and technical personnel under Operation Paperclip, the American program that recruited Nazi scientists for post-war employment in American military and civilian research institutions, generated documentation that was systematically managed in ways designed to ensure that the backgrounds of recruited individuals would not become obstacles to their employment. Security reports that identified Nazi Party membership, SS affiliation, or documented participation in wartime programs that had used concentration camp labor were in some cases altered. In other cases, the relevant portions of background reports were reclassified at levels that effectively removed them from the review process. The personnel files of scientists who were brought into American programs contain, in some cases, 2 distinct layers: an outer layer that represents what was made available for review purposes, and an inner layer of original documentation that tells a substantially different story about the individual's wartime activities. Both layers exist in the archive. The outer layer was created deliberately, which means the creation of the outer layer was itself documented somewhere, though the documentation of the documentation creation is among the most difficult material to access. The Soviet Union's wartime documentation practices were shaped by a political system in which the boundary between the historical record and the political needs of the present was essentially non-existent. Documents were created, altered, and destroyed not on any consistent principle, but in response to the immediate political requirements of whoever was in power. At the time, the document in question became politically relevant. The Katyn massacre, in which approximately 22,000 Polish military officers, police and intellectuals were killed by the Soviet NKVD in the spring of 1940, was attributed in Soviet documentation to German forces for decades. The fabricated documentation was extensive and detailed. Forensic reports were created. Witness statements were taken. Trial records from the Nuremberg Tribunal, where the Soviets had included the Katyn massacre in their indictment of German leaders, existed as official international legal documents, despite the fact that the tribunal had quietly declined to include the massacre in the final judgment because the evidence available to the other Allied prosecutors suggested that the Soviet attribution was false. The Soviet government maintained its false account officially until 1990, when Mikhail Gorbachev acknowledged Soviet responsibility. The documentation underlying the false account, the fabricated reports and manufactured witness statements, remained in Russian archives and was not made fully accessible to researchers for years after the political acknowledgement of Soviet responsibility. The documentation of the forced transfer of ethnic populations across Eastern Europe in the period immediately following the end of the war constitutes one of the largest archival gaps in the history of the conflict, because it falls in a zone that was politically inconvenient for virtually every government with an interest in managing it. Between 1944 and 1950, somewhere between 12 and 14 million ethnic Germans were expelled from territories in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Yugoslavia. The expulsion was accompanied, particularly in its early phases, by widespread violence, with documented massacres, sexual assaults, and deliberate starvation of expelled populations. The governments of the countries conducting the expulsions had strong reasons not to document the violence in detail. The Allied powers, particularly the United States and Britain, had endorsed the expulsion in principle at the Potsdam Conference and had their own reasons for not wanting detailed documentation of the conditions under which it was conducted to become publicly available. The result was that the documentary record of what happened is fragmentary, distributed across archives in multiple countries, each of which maintained access restrictions for different periods and for different stated reasons. The internal communications of the International Committee of the Red Cross during the war years represent a source that historians have found both invaluable and deeply troubling. The ICRC had access to information about the treatment of prisoners and civilian populations that no other neutral organization possessed, and its internal communications reflect a detailed awareness of conditions that the organization's public statements never acknowledged. The question of what the ICRC knew, and when it knew it, and what it chose to do or not do with that knowledge, has been the subject of significant historical controversy. The organization's own archives, which it kept closed to researchers for decades after the war, contain internal communications that show an awareness of the systematic killing of Jewish populations in German-controlled Europe at dates earlier than the ICRC's public statements acknowledged. The decision not to make public statements about what the ICRC's own representatives were reporting from the field was a decision made by the organization's leadership after internal deliberation. The deliberation was documented. The minutes of the meetings at which the decision was made and repeatedly reaffirmed exist. The reasoning recorded in those minutes was not primarily moral, but strategic. The organization's leadership believed that public statements would compromise its access and therefore its ability to function, and that functioning access, even at reduced effectiveness, was preferable to no access, which they believed would result from public confrontation with the German government. Whether that reasoning was correct is a question historians continue to debate. What is not debated is that the reasoning was institutional rather than moral, that it was documented, and that the documentation was kept from public view for decades. The handling of documents relating to Japanese-American internment within the United States government created a paper trail whose management tells its own story about how democracies handled documentation of their own institutional decisions. The legal basis for the internment, Executive Order 9066, signed by Franklin Roosevelt in February 1942, was publicly issued and publicly known. What was less publicly visible was the internal deliberative record showing the degree to which military and civilian officials knew, at the time the order was being prepared, that the military necessity argument being used to justify it was not supported by the intelligence available to them. A report prepared by Curtis Munson for the State Department in late 1941, which concluded that Japanese Americans on the West Coast did not represent a significant security threat, was not made public at the time. The report existed. It circulated in classified channels. Officials who had read it nevertheless made public statements and legal arguments premised on a security threat that their own classified reporting indicated did not exist in the form being described. The gap between the classified record and the public record in this case is not subtle. It is stark, and it was visible to anyone with access to both layers of the documentation. The decades-long legal case that ultimately resulted in a 1988 apology and reparations was driven in significant part by the discovery, by a legal team working in the 1980s, of documents that had not been destroyed, but that had been filed in ways that made them effectively inaccessible for 40 years. The documentation of American bombing of neutral nations during the war, including the bombing of Switzerland on multiple occasions and the bombing of neutral Sweden's territory, was handled in ways that prioritized diplomatic management over accurate historical record. The American military was aware that bombing errors had resulted in attacks on neutral territory. Internal investigations were conducted. The investigations produced findings. The findings were communicated through diplomatic channels in forms that were calibrated to minimize political damage rather than to accurately describe what had happened. The gap between the internal investigation findings and the diplomatic communications based on those findings is, in the cases where both exist in archives, sometimes substantial. The records of the German occupation administration in the Soviet Union, particularly the documentation relating to the activities of the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that operated behind the advancing German front lines, present a documentary situation that is unusual in the history of mass violence, in that the documentation is extensive and was not, for the most part, deliberately suppressed by the people who created it. The Einsatzgruppen filed regular operational reports to Berlin, describing in careful administrative language the activities of each unit, including the numbers of people killed, categorized by the categories the units used, and the locations and methods used. These reports were typed, copied, distributed to multiple offices, and filed. The men who wrote them were describing mass killings in the language of inventory management and productivity reporting. The document is filed. The number is recorded. The unit moves to the next location. The reporting continues. What makes this documentation disturbing is not anything hidden about it. It is the surface. The surface is an administrative record that treats the killing of human beings as a logistical function to be reported on like any other logistical function. The people who received these reports in Berlin processed them through their offices, noted their contents, and moved on to the next item. The system did not require anyone to pause and register what the numbers meant, because the system was designed around the numbers as data, not as representations of individual human lives. The bureaucratic architecture of the reporting system was itself a form of suppression, not in the sense of hiding the information, but in the sense of presenting it in a format that stripped it of the quality that would have made it emotionally legible to the people processing it. The medical documentation generated by German military and SS physicians during the war represents a body of material that the post-war medical and scientific communities handled with considerable ambivalence. The research conducted in concentration camps on prisoners who were not consenting and who were in many cases killed in the course of the research produced data that was, in a narrow technical sense, real. The question of what to do with that data was debated, quietly and without much public visibility, in medical journals and institutional discussions in the decades following the war. The debate itself was rarely documented in ways that would make it accessible to public scrutiny, because the debate touched on things that were professionally uncomfortable. Journals that had published research based on data from wartime German experiments sometimes handled this by simply not acknowledging the provenance of the underlying data. Textbooks that included findings derived from wartime research sometimes stripped the citations in ways that made the origin of the information untraceable without significant archival effort. The practical effect was that knowledge derived from experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners entered the mainstream of certain medical and scientific fields in ways that obscured its origins. The documentation of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and more broadly of armed Jewish resistance during the Holocaust, exists in fragments across multiple archives and represents one of the clearest cases of politically motivated archival management. Multiple governments had reasons to manage this documentation in specific ways for specific political purposes. The Israeli government, after its establishment in 1948, had reasons to emphasize Jewish resistance as part of a national narrative. The Polish government had reasons to manage the documentation in ways consistent with the particular version of Polish wartime experience it wanted to project domestically and internationally. The Soviet government had reasons to emphasize certain aspects of resistance and suppress others, depending on the political affiliations of the groups involved. The result is that the historical picture that exists of armed Jewish resistance during the Holocaust has been shaped at the level of what documents were preserved, what was made accessible, and what was highlighted in official commemorative contexts by political agendas that frequently operated independently of the goal of accurate historical reconstruction. The documentation relating to the looting of art and cultural property by German forces across occupied Europe and the subsequent disposition of recovered art by Allied forces tells a story of institutional behavior that is considerably more complicated than the clean narrative of theft by villains and recovery by liberators. The Allied forces that advanced through Germany in the final stages of the war encountered enormous quantities of looted art, and the documentation of what happened to that art in the period between discovery and official processing is fragmentary in ways that are not entirely accounted for by the chaos of military operations. Art that was officially processed through the Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives program generated documentation. Art that was removed before it reached official processing channels did not, or generated documentation that was itself subject to management. American military reports from the period note the presence of large quantities of valuable objects in areas where they were not subsequently found when official accounting was conducted. Where those objects went, and what documentation exists of their movement, remains an area of incomplete archival reconstruction. The signals intelligence records of the major powers during the war represent some of the most extensively classified documentation of the 20th century, with significant portions remaining under access restrictions that have been only partially lifted decades after the events they document. The British decryption operation at Bletchley Park, which successfully broke German Enigma encrypted communications throughout most of the war, generated intelligence that was distributed to British commanders and, through carefully managed channels, to American and other Allied commanders in ways designed to prevent the Germans from discovering that their communications were being read. The management of this intelligence, the decisions about what to act on and what to deliberately ignore in order to protect the source, has been documented to some extent in official histories that were authorized precisely because official disclosure was seen as preferable to uncontrolled revelation. But the full record of what was known, when it was known, and what decisions were made on the basis of that knowledge remains incomplete in ways that are consequential for understanding specific events. The question of what British intelligence knew about specific German military operations before they occurred, and what was done or deliberately not done with that knowledge, has generated scholarly controversy that cannot be fully resolved with the documentation currently available. The internal communications of the intelligence services, the records of briefings given to political leadership, the records of decisions about how to act or not act on specific intelligence exist in partial form. The partial form is not accidental. It reflects decisions made at the time about what to document and what to communicate verbally, decisions that were themselves driven by an awareness that documentation created accountability and that verbal communication did not. The post-war prosecution of German war criminals at Nuremberg generated documentation of its own, including internal deliberations among the prosecuting powers about which charges to bring, which evidence to use, and which potential defendants to pursue or not pursue. Some of this deliberative documentation is available, some of it is not. The decisions about who to prosecute and who not to prosecute were driven by a range of considerations that included, but were not limited to, the evidentiary strength of particular cases. Political considerations played a role. The desire to manage the scope of the trials, to prevent them from expanding into territory that would be uncomfortable for the prosecuting powers, played a role. The specific decision to limit the scope of the indictment in ways that excluded certain categories of conduct in which Allied forces had engaged played a role. These decisions were made and in some cases documented, but the documentation is distributed across the archives of multiple governments, each of which has managed access according to its own institutional interests. The Soviet refusal to allow Nuremberg prosecutors access to documentation of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact's secret protocols, which had divided Eastern Europe between Germany and the Soviet Union before the German invasion of Poland, meant that a significant piece of the documentary context for the origins of the war was excluded from the official trial record. The existence of the secret protocols was known to the prosecuting powers. The decision not to press for their inclusion in the Nuremberg proceedings was a decision made deliberately about what the historical record of the trials would contain. The protocols themselves did not become officially acknowledged until 1989, when the Soviet government admitted their existence. The originals were found in Soviet archives in 1992. The documentation generated by the German railway system, the Reichsbahn, in connection with the transportation of deportees to killing facilities, represents a category of evidence that is both extensively preserved and rarely discussed in its full operational scope. The railway bureaucracy operated on standard administrative principles. Trains had to be scheduled. Capacity had to be allocated. Payment had to be arranged because the transportation of deportees was done at standard commercial rates, with the SS paying the Reichsbahn by the head for transportation services. Receipts were generated, invoices were filed, scheduling requests were submitted through normal administrative channels. The railway staff who processed these documents processed them as transportation requests, which is what they were administratively, and the documentation they generated reflects that framing with a completeness and consistency that is, in retrospect, one of the more complete records of a component of the Holocaust, simply because the railway bureaucracy was doing what railway bureaucracies do, which is maintain meticulous records of everything they transport. The documentation of the economic dimension of the Holocaust, the systematic expropriation of Jewish-owned property, businesses, and financial assets across German-controlled Europe, generated paper trails in banking, insurance, legal, and governmental institutions across multiple countries that have been the subject of decades of legal and archival investigation, much of which is still ongoing. Swiss banks maintained accounts belonging to Holocaust victims that remained unclaimed after the war. The documentation of those accounts existed. The question of what the banks knew about the account holders' fate and what they did with that knowledge was the subject of investigations in the 1990s that produced reports drawing on internal banking documentation. The internal banking documentation showed in some cases that banks were aware that account holders were deceased and had been killed in circumstances that were, by any reasonable interpretation, known to the banks, and that this knowledge did not translate into systematic efforts to identify heirs or manage the accounts in ways consistent with that knowledge. Insurance companies across Europe had sold policies to people who were subsequently killed in the Holocaust. The companies maintained their records. The policies existed. The companies survived the war. In many cases, they continued to function in the post-war period without any systematic process for identifying and paying claims by the families of Holocaust victims. The documentation of this, the internal communications of insurance company executives in the post-war period as they navigated the question of how to handle this category of unclaimed and unpaid policies, became available to researchers through litigation and regulatory proceedings decades after the events. The internal communications show a consistent pattern of institutional behavior oriented toward minimizing the category, not because the institutions were committed to concealment in any dramatic sense, but because the alternative, a comprehensive accounting of what was owed and to whom, was an operationally and financially challenging undertaking that the institutions had no external pressure to undertake. The documentation of forced and slave labor programs used by German industry during the war period created a paper trail across German corporate archives that was managed in the post-war period in ways shaped by the legal and political situation of German corporations in a defeated country. Companies that had used concentration camp labor or other forms of forced labor had legal exposure in a post-war environment where forced labor had been declared a war crime. The documentary evidence of corporate participation in forced labor programs existed in corporate archives. The handling of those archives in the decades following the war, the decisions about what to preserve, what to classify as commercially sensitive, and what to make available to researchers or to legal proceedings, was itself a form of archival management, with significant consequences for the historical record and for the legal accountability of institutions that had profited from wartime atrocities. Some of these institutions eventually faced legal proceedings decades after the war, in which the archival record was central. The proceedings themselves generated documentation about what had been preserved, what had been lost, and what the gaps in the record represented in terms of what could and could not be proven. The legal standard of proof and the historical standard of understanding are not the same standard, and the management of corporate archives across the post-war period had the effect of calibrating what could be proved legally, even as the historical understanding of what had happened became increasingly clear. The documentation of German medical experimentation in concentration camps, beyond the direct records of the experiments themselves, includes a body of material relating to the administrative relationship between the SS, which operated the camps, and the medical and scientific institutions of the Reich, which provided personnel, funding, and institutional legitimacy to the research programs. Universities, research institutes, and professional medical associations were involved in the administration and oversight of programs that conducted research on human subjects who were not free to refuse. The documentation of this institutional involvement, the correspondence between camp administrators and university faculty, the grant applications and funding decisions, the publication of research findings in academic journals, exists in fragments across multiple archives and has been pieced together by researchers over decades of archival work. The picture that emerges is not of a program operating outside normal scientific institutional structures, but of one deeply embedded in them, using their administrative infrastructure, their professional legitimacy, and their publication channels. The documentation of how the Japanese military handled the systematic use of women from occupied countries as forced sexual laborers in what the military administration described through euphemistic terminology as comfort stations has been subject to archival management by both the Japanese government and, to varying degrees, the governments of countries whose nationals were among those subjected to the system. Japanese governmental archives related to the system were in many cases destroyed in the final stages of the war. The destruction was documented in some cases with orders to destroy specific categories of documents issued through military and governmental channels in the weeks before the surrender. What survived was fragmentary, and its survival was in many cases accidental. Material that had not been identified for destruction because it was filed under administrative categories that did not trigger the destruction orders. The Japanese government's management of surviving documentation on this subject in the post-war period has been the subject of significant scholarly and diplomatic controversy, with researchers and representatives of survivor communities arguing that access to relevant archives has been systematically restricted and that governmental acknowledgement of the system's scope and official nature has been managed in ways designed to limit legal and political exposure. The documentary history of the controversy itself, the correspondence between researchers and archival authorities, the records of what was requested and what was provided or declined, constitutes a secondary layer of documentation about the management of the primary documentation. The records of Allied prisoner of war management, particularly of German prisoners held by the United States and Britain, tell a story that diverges in significant ways from the official narrative of humane treatment consistent with the Geneva Conventions. The treatment of German prisoners of war in the final stages of the conflict and immediately following the German surrender included conditions of captivity that, in the American case, were facilitated by a deliberate definitional decision. In the weeks before the German surrender, the American military created a new category, disarmed enemy forces, which designated certain German military personnel as distinct from prisoners of war under the Geneva Conventions. This definitional maneuver, documented in military orders and communications, had the practical effect of removing the relevant population from the protections that the conventions provided, including protections relating to food rations and shelter. The documentation of the conditions experienced by people held in this category, the mortality rates, the nutritional status, the physical conditions of the enclosures in which they were held, exists in military records and in post-war interviews and memoirs, though it was not something the American military chose to integrate into its official public accounting of the post-war period. The French management of German prisoners in the post-war period generated documentation of conditions that were worse in terms of mortality rates than those in the American or British camps, and that were explicitly described in internal French military communications in terms that acknowledged the conditions fell below the standards that would apply to recognized prisoners of war. The French government had significant reasons of domestic politics and national dignity to manage public awareness of this, and the documentation remained restricted for decades in ways that shaped the historiography of the post-war period in France. The documentation of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and of the decision-making process that led to those bombings has been subject to archival management by the American government in ways that have shaped the historical understanding of the decision in significant and sometimes visible ways. The internal deliberations of the Interim Committee, which advised the Secretary of War on the use of atomic weapons, were classified for years after the war and became the subject of sustained historical controversy as they became available. The records of the Target Committee, which selected the specific targets for the bombings, including the deliberations about which cities were on the target list and why, were classified. The internal communications of military and civilian officials in the weeks leading up to the bombings, which reveal the range of views about the necessity of the bombings and the alternatives that were considered or not considered, were managed in ways that shaped the public account of the decision as one of clear military necessity with no viable alternatives. The scientific monitoring data collected by American aircraft in the immediate aftermath of the bombings, which documented radiation levels and their effects on surviving populations, was classified by the American military and remained classified for years. The organization created to study the effects of the bombings on the Japanese population, the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, was operating in a context where the data it collected was sensitive for military reasons, because it bore on questions about the military effects of atomic weapons that the American government was actively managing as part of its post-war strategic position. The Japanese survivors who were studied by the Commission were in a politically vulnerable position in an occupied country, and the data collected from and about them was held and managed by an American institution with priorities that were not purely those of neutral medical research. The documentation of American firebombing campaigns over Japanese cities in the period before the atomic bombings, which killed larger numbers of people than either atomic bombing, received considerably less post-war archival management than the atomic bombing documentation because it was considerably less politically sensitive. The firebombing campaign, conducted under General LeMay's command, was documented in operational records that were not particularly restricted. The political sensitivity of the atomic bombings, by contrast, triggered a level of documentation management that has made the decision-making process around those bombings one of the most studied and most contested pieces of military history, with the controversy itself shaped by the fact that the archival record was released in stages over decades, with each stage of release prompting revision of the historical interpretation that had been based on the previously available material. The documentation of American biological weapons research during the war, conducted at facilities including Camp Detrick in Maryland, was classified at levels that have been only partially lifted in the decades since the war. The relationship between this research and the American decision to extend immunity to Japanese biological warfare researchers from Unit 731, the program whose documentation the American government suppressed, is visible in the archival record at the level of institutional connections between the researchers who received the Unit 731 data and the researchers who were pursuing parallel American programs. The documentation of what data was exchanged, in what form, and how it was used in American research programs is distributed across multiple classified archives, some of which remain restricted. The British documentation of its own biological weapons research during the war, including experiments conducted on Gruinard Island off the coast of Scotland, was restricted for decades. The island was contaminated with anthrax spores from the wartime testing and remained quarantined until 1990. The documentation of the contamination, the extent of it and the reasons it was not addressed for decades following the war, was managed in ways that served institutional interests in not acknowledging the scale of what had been done to a piece of British territory. The records generated by the occupation of the Philippines under Japanese military administration, including documentation of the Bataan Death March and conditions in prisoner-of-war camps, involved documentary material that was managed by the Japanese military in the final stages of the war in the same pattern as other categories of sensitive documentation, with destruction orders issued through administrative channels as the military situation deteriorated. What survived was the product of incomplete destruction, documents that were not found in time, documents that were filed under categories that did not trigger specific destruction orders, documents that individual Japanese military personnel chose not to destroy for their own reasons. The war crimes trials conducted in the Asia-Pacific theater, which were less comprehensive and received less international attention than the Nuremberg trials, were subject to political and strategic considerations that shaped their scope in ways that have been documented by historians working with the available archival material. The decision about which Japanese officials and military commanders to prosecute and at what level to stop the investigation was influenced by the American decision to retain Emperor Hirohito and to use the imperial institution as a stabilizing element in the occupation and reconstruction of Japan. The documentation of this decision, and of its implications for the scope of accountability that the trials would achieve, exists in American occupation authority records and in communications between MacArthur's headquarters and Washington. The archival accessibility of this documentation has varied over time in ways that have shaped the historiographical understanding of the post-war accountability process in Japan. The documentation of what happened to the German civilian population in the Soviet-occupied zone of Germany in the final stages of the war and in the immediate post-war period, including widespread rape and organized looting of the civilian population, was managed by the Soviet military and political authorities in ways consistent with their general approach to documentation of their own forces' conduct. Soviet military records from this period that dealt with crimes committed against the German civilian population were classified and remained inaccessible to Western researchers for decades. What eventually became available through Soviet and later Russian archival openings, combined with the post-war testimony of German civilians, is a body of evidence pointing to the scale and systematicity of violence against the civilian population that challenges the clean narrative of the war's end. The documentation of the Allied bombing of Monte Cassino in February 1944, which destroyed a monastery of enormous historical and cultural significance based on intelligence assessments of German military use that were subsequently found to be incorrect, was managed in ways that reflected the military's awareness that the decision had been both controversial and based on faulty intelligence. The internal investigation of the intelligence failure, the records of what was known and assessed before the decision was made, and the communications between commanders about the decision exist in archival form, but were classified for years after the war. The bombing and its consequences were publicly known, but the internal deliberative record of the decision remained restricted, which meant that the public accounting of the decision was limited to what commanders chose to say publicly, which was not consistent with what the internal documentation showed about the state of the intelligence available to them. The records of the German Navy's submarine campaign, and specifically the records relating to the sinking of ships carrying civilian passengers and the killing of survivors in the water, document a pattern of escalation that was tracked internally by the German Naval High Command through the operational reports of individual submarine commanders. The internal deliberation about rules of engagement and the evolution of those rules over the course of the war is visible in the documentation in ways that show a systematic process of authorizing conduct that was prohibited under the laws of naval warfare as they existed at the time. The documentation of this process was part of the evidentiary basis for the prosecution of German naval commanders at Nuremberg, where it was used to establish that the rules of engagement in force were the product of deliberate policy decisions rather than individual battlefield choices. The documentation of the German military's use of prisoner-of-war labor in violation of the Geneva Conventions, and specifically the use of Soviet prisoners of war in conditions of deliberate starvation, was generated in part by the German military's own supply and logistics bureaucracy, which tracked food rations by category of recipient in ways that made the differential treatment of Soviet prisoners statistically visible in the records. The mortality rates of Soviet prisoners of war in German captivity during the first years of the war, approximately 3 million dead of a total of approximately 5.5 million captured, were the product of a deliberate policy, documented in internal communications from the highest levels of the German military command, of treating Soviet prisoners as a category not entitled to the protections of international law. The documentation of this policy, and of the institutional process through which it was formulated and communicated, exists in German military records captured at the end of the war. The intersection of the Holocaust with the wartime governance structures of countries that were German allies or occupied by Germany, particularly France, generated documentation of collaboration between French administrative institutions and German occupation authorities that was managed in the post-war French political context with considerable care. The Vichy government's own documentation of its participation in the deportation of Jewish people from France, the records of French police actions, French administrative decisions, French institutional cooperation with German racial policies, was preserved in French governmental archives, but access to it was restricted in ways that served the post-war political need to construct a narrative of French resistance and French victimhood that marginalized the documentation of French collaboration. The archival restrictions were maintained through multiple political periods, and the historians who eventually gained access to the material found a documentary record of institutional collaboration that was considerably more extensive than the public narrative had indicated. The documentation of German military conduct in Yugoslavia, where the Wehrmacht and SS operated against partisan forces in a campaign that involved systematic reprisals against civilian populations at ratios that were documented in German military orders, tells a story of institutionalized collective punishment administered through normal military channels. The reprisal ratios, the number of civilians to be killed for each German soldier killed by partisan action, were set by German military commanders, communicated in writing through the chain of command, and reported on in operational documents that track the execution of the reprisal policy against specific population figures. The documentation is formal, procedural, and comprehensive in ways that reflect the German military bureaucracy's standard approach to operational reporting. The records of the German occupation of Greece, including the documentation of the deliberate starvation of the Greek civilian population through a combination of direct confiscation of food stocks and the economic disruption of German occupation policies, were captured at the end of the war and used in war crimes proceedings. The internal German documentation of the food supply situation in occupied Greece includes, in some cases, communications from occupation officials that acknowledge the mortality impact of their policies on the civilian population, without this acknowledgement producing any policy revision. The food was needed for German military purposes. The documentation of the civilian mortality was filed. The policy continued. The wartime documentation generated by neutral countries, particularly Switzerland and Sweden, in connection with their commercial and financial relationships with the belligerents on both sides, represents a body of material that those countries managed with considerable care in the post-war period. Swiss banking records relating to transactions with German institutions, Swedish commercial records relating to the supply of iron ore and other strategic materials to Germany were the subjects of post-war investigations that produced reports drawing on archival material whose accessibility was shaped by the interest of the institutions involved in limiting the scope of what was established. The investigations and the reports they produced documented profitable commercial relationships between neutral countries and wartime Germany that continued through periods when the activities being facilitated by those relationships were matters of documented public knowledge. The documentation of the internal deliberations within Swiss and Swedish governmental and business institutions about the continuation of those relationships, as awareness of what Germany was doing with the materials and financial services being provided, grew, represents one of the more revealing categories of wartime documentation about the behavior of countries that were not belligerents, but were not, in any operational sense, uninvolved. The records of the American Office of Strategic Services, predecessor to the Central Intelligence Agency, include wartime documentation that has been released in stages over decades in ways that have consistently revealed more about the scope of American wartime intelligence operations than the prior releases had indicated. The OSS operated in ways that generated documentation of relationships with individuals and organizations that were, in some cases, simultaneously operating in ways that would have been described as criminal or as collaboration if the same activities had been conducted without OSS sanction. The documentation of these relationships was classified at levels that ensured it would not be immediately available in the post-war period, when those relationships might have created difficulties for the post-war trajectories of the individuals involved. The documentation of the British Special Operations Executive's wartime activities, including operations in occupied Europe that involved sabotage, assassination, and the cultivation of resistance networks, was classified and managed in ways that protected both the methods used and the identities of individuals involved. The SOE's internal records include documentation of operations whose outcomes were in some cases significantly different from what was officially recorded, and of relationships between the organization and foreign governments in exile that were complicated by competing political agendas. Some categories of SOE documentation were destroyed before the end of the war or in the immediate post-war period, as a matter of deliberate policy. The destruction was itself documented in some cases, with orders and administrative records indicating that specific categories of material were to be disposed of. What this means for the historical record is that the gaps in the SOE archive are not random, but reflect deliberate decisions about what categories of information should not be preserved. The documentation of the American and British military's awareness of the Holocaust as it was occurring, and specifically the documentation relating to the decision not to bomb the rail lines leading to Auschwitz or the camp facilities themselves, has been the subject of sustained historical research and controversy since the mid-1970s. The documents showing that the Allies had aerial reconnaissance photographs of the Auschwitz complex, that the camp's location and function were known to Allied intelligence agencies, and that requests to bomb the rail lines or the facility were received and explicitly declined, became available through archival releases that occurred over an extended period and that continued to complicate the official understanding of what had been known and decided. The internal communications relating to these decisions when they became available showed a range of arguments made against the bombing proposals, some of which were military and logistical in nature, and some of which reflected priorities about the allocation of resources that were being made in a context where the primary goal of winning the war was treated as separable from, rather than related to, the goal of interrupting the killing operations at Auschwitz. The documentation generated by the end of the war, the armistice and surrender instruments, the disposition of territories, the assignment of occupation zones, and the distribution of displaced populations, was itself the product of decisions made in settings where the major powers were negotiating future positions as much as they were administering the end of the conflict. The documentation of those negotiations, particularly the communications between the American, British, and Soviet governments in the final year of the war about the post-war disposition of Europe and Asia, exists in archival form and has been the subject of substantial historical research. What the documentation shows is a process of great power negotiation in which the populations of the territories being negotiated about were objects of the negotiation rather than participants in it, in which agreements were made verbally or in forms that deliberately limited the documentary record, and in which commitments were understood by the parties making them to be contingent on future power relationships rather than binding in any juridical sense. The Yalta Agreements of February 1945, which committed the Soviet Union to entering the war against Japan in exchange for territorial concessions in Asia, and which established the framework for the post-war division of Europe, included provisions that were documented with varying degrees of specificity, and whose interpretation was contested almost immediately after the agreements were concluded. The gap between what was agreed, what was documented, and what each party understood to have been agreed is itself visible in the documentation, because the parties' subsequent behavior and communications reflect different understandings of what the documents meant. This gap was not a product of translation difficulties or simple misunderstanding. It was a product of deliberate ambiguity maintained in the text of the agreements to allow each party to commit to something that its domestic and strategic situation required it to commit to without creating a record that would constrain its subsequent freedom of action. The war ended, in the formal sense, through a series of surrender documents signed in specific locations on specific dates. Those documents created legal terminations of the conflict in ways that were procedurally definitive. What they did not do, and what no document could do, was resolve the institutional, bureaucratic, and systemic structures that had made the war function the way it functioned. The people who had staffed those structures, who had processed the paperwork, who had filed the reports and followed the orders and applied the stamps, went on to staff other institutions. Some of them faced accountability for specific actions that could be documented to specific decisions. Most of them did not. The files went into storage. Some were opened, some were burned, some were reclassified, and some remain in categories whose existence is a matter of official record, but whose contents are not yet available for inspection. The systems that had moved the war through its procedural channels adapted to new requirements. The paperwork continued.